Effects of eastern hemlock decline on the hemlock-associated liverwort Bazzania trilobata by Michelle Jackson from Smith College.
Thank you. Okay, so this title is a little bit convoluted, but I can promise you at the end of this talk I will sort of have deconstructed everything for you. But to sort of dive right in, I'd like to give a little background on the eastern hemlock ecosystem where my study takes place. Eastern hemlock, Suga canadensis, is considered a foundation species by researchers because it has a series of traits that support a variety of different organisms, including creating this cool, shaded, damp microclimate that leads to sort of acidic litter, slow decomposition, poor soils, and as I said, it supports various organisms including macroinvertebrates, birds, freshwater fish, and even salamanders, and there's lots of literature on this. And within this sort of complex eastern hemlock ecosystem, there exists this problem that many of you are probably familiar with surrounding two invasive insects, hemlock woolly adelgid, Adelgisugae, and elongate hemlock scale Bazzania externa, which I have pictures of here. And essentially, these particular insects have been documented in New England since the mid-1980s and have sort of been causing more and more damage in the past decade or so. And as you can see here, this picture was taken near the Northampton Reservoir in 2012, and there's this gap in this hemlock canopy. These invasive insects consume the needle tissue, and that can lead to sort of the slow decline and eventual mortality in many stands that's happening in various forests around here. But in addition to this issue with the invasive insects, you also have sort of problems surrounding this preemptive and salvage logging of eastern hemlock that's happening. So there's this forestry technique that's being used to save whatever remaining sort of economic value exists for eastern hemlock before the invasive gets them. These foresters are taking these trees out, and this is sort of contributing to sort of more abrupt disturbance within this ecosystem, including changes in soil pH, nutrient cycling, and sort of the obvious opening up to canopy and exposing understory plant species to more light. And this is actually happening in areas nearby. This photo was taken near the McLeish Field Station where my field study took place, and so this is happening nearby. And so kind of continuing on this idea of how this impacts the understory plants, I was thinking how this might impact bryophytes, which are a grade of plants that contain mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Most people are familiar with the mosses. The study species I'm looking at, Bazzania trilobata, is a liverwort. This here is an example of a thalloid liverwort, so sort of the more rounded liver-like shape that sort of gives it its name. And to give you a better idea of how these plants diverged, I have a phylogeny, and as you can see, you have a green algae, and then liverworts come first, and the bryophyte grades shares the synapomorphies of an embryo, multicellular sporophyte, waxy cuticle. But what's interesting is actually that the liverworts lack stomates, and then you have the vascular plants. So this sort of issue of lacking stomates contributes to kind of differences with liverworts, such that they have these instead air pores rather than stomates with guard cells that allow for gas exchange and water exchange, but this seems to suggest that they would regulate water differently than the other land plants, and so they might be more at risk and prone to desiccation and sort of relying on ambient moisture that in their environment. And I'll sort of come back to this towards the end of my talk and how those sort of environmental issues might be impacting this liverwort. So to sort of connect these two things. Yes?
Elizabeth, could you get the lights down a little?
So to sort of connect these two features, the idea that hemlock can act as this foundation species for bryophytes because it creates this cool, moist, acidic, shady environment. There is literature to support that Bazzania trilobata seems to have this connection with eastern hemlock. So Bazzania trilobata is known to be found in calcareous soils, so the acidic litter that is provided by hemlock would certainly be fine, and there was a significant study conducted by Cleve et al. In 2007 that actually looked at water retention in Bazzania trilobata within hemlock forest. So this sort of relationship exists. A little bit more on Bazzania trilobata. It was named after an Italian scientist, and the rest of its name sort of comes from the idea that it has this incubus leaf insertion, which you can see here, where the leaves are sort of stacked on top of one another like roof shingles, but they also have toothed edges in little groups of 3, hence trilobata. And to provide a little more background on just what its habitat is, it's found in these older growth hemlock forests, especially on rocks and the bases of trees and stumps. It needs a substrate to survive. So to sort of go into the project that I conducted for my undergraduate honors thesis, essentially the question that I'm looking at overall are what are the effects that the decline of eastern hemlock might have on Bazzania trilobata, and I hypothesized that in stands that have been salvage logged or experiencing attack by these 2 invasive insects, that the Bazzania would decline. And you also have this sort of issue of succession from hemlock to deciduous trees such as black birch. And what's sort of interesting about the approach that we took to this project is that rather than sort of waiting for years for hemlock decline to happen and logging to happen at these sites, we moved samples of Bazzania trilobata into areas where these conditions pre-existed. And so basically the methodology behind this study is an experimental transplant that took place, as I said, in part at McLeish Field Station in Whately and an older growth forest in Conway, which was actually the source site for the Bazzania trilobata as well as acting as the control. And there were 8 transects in total with 176 samples. And basically at the experimental site, these different transects reflected variation and changes in canopy tree species going from sort of strictly hemlock into sort of mixed stands with deciduous, as well as varying slope and aspect. And here's just sort of a little map at McLeish. There were the 7 transects here, the 7th of which actually is streamside to sort of incorporate direct moisture. And this is just a little collage to kind of give you an idea of what the setup looked like. So along each transect you had 2 samples of Bazzania. They're all sort of nestled in on this little rotted hemlock substrate and covered by bird netting and supported by landscape tables to kind of keep them in place. And this is actually the stream side at McLeish during a particularly dry point of that season. And so these transects were monitored during the field surveys to sort of assess whether these samples were considered stable or in declining. So this was sort of this visual assessment based on changes in texture and coloration. So stable samples were considered based on how green they were, level of moisture, and sort of some even experienced new growth, while declining samples were generally discolored, sometimes photo bleaching, and just clearly on their way out and were not recovering. This particular sample was actually in an area that sort of mimics clear cut, which was part of the different transects as well, to kind of keep that different gradient as well. So in addition to sort of visually assessing these, we looked at predictor variables that might influence Bazzania trilobata status. So quantifying soil moisture levels by collecting wet soil and then calculating the difference with dry soil weight, and then doing solar radiation by getting slope and aspect and inputting that data into a model called ClimeCalc, and as well calculating the number of eastern hemlock at each point along the transect, which was actually done using this tool here, which is an angle gauge to sort of timber cruise our way down the transects. And so to get into the results from my study, basically the first thing that we looked at was the influence of moisture on the stability of Bazzania trilobata. So you have moisture, which was in categories from 30% to 85% on the x-axis, and you have the percent of stable Bazzania on the y-axis. And as you can see here, there's sort of this curvilineal relationship expressed here, which suggests that there's kind of this complex soil moisture niche for Bazzania, where it's persisting at sort of 50-60% moisture for sure, but it doesn't do well in areas that are too arid or too moist. And this is particularly interesting when then you take the next predictor variable that we considered, which was solar radiation. So what I'm about to do is kind of create this niche space for you on the screen here. So if this line, blue line moisture, comes up, and then you have average radiation, which is this yellow line, you can see that in areas of high solar radiation, the decline is orange and stable samples are green. You have sort of this high decline in association with solar radiation, but to sort of go back to the previous graph that I showed you, there's also decline in association with high organic moisture. And so this is sort of, again, giving us this idea that Bazzania trilobata can persist in areas where sort of you have this different environmental changes like this exposure to light. And so what's even more interesting is you take the final sort of predictor variable that we assessed, which was the number of eastern hemlock trees. And as you can see here, you have in areas with average radiation, again on the y-axis, the number of eastern hemlock trees on the x-axis. In areas with high solar radiation, you have high decline, but as you sort of add more eastern hemlock trees, you can see there's kind of this buffering effect that happens where here there's a little bit less decline, you have 5 to 10 trees, but once you get into the range of 15 to 20 trees at each point along the transect, there's hardly any decline at all. And then we did statistical analysis on this using a logistic regression. So we evaluated the individual predictor variables versus stable sample status, the stable and decline. And as you can see here, while all of these variables actually were significant in their own way individually, ultimately lower hemlock abundance appears to be sort of the strongest predictor of Bazzania decline, which you can see here based on the R-squared value and the p-value, excuse me. And so to sort of go into my conclusions, this is very interesting what we're finding because it seems that Bazzania trilobata might actually be an eastern hemlock specialist, which could have serious ramifications depending on the trajectory of the 2 invasive insects and what happens with salvage logging. And again, sort of what we're finding is that there are the different predictor variables explored sort of suggest this complex niche for the species, and much more work needs to be done to sort of elaborate on this because this study actually took place just in under 2 years. And to reiterate, hemlock abundance sort of emerges as top factor in connection to sample performance and stability. And it seems that in this case, Bazzania might be sort of the first clear example of a plant species that's dependent on hemlock ecosystems, which is very interesting when you consider the literature has focused primarily on animals and plant organisms like that. And as well, so sort of coming again to this conclusion that depending on what happens with hemlock-related delgid and the elongate hemlock scale, Bazzania could possibly be lost as well. So this seems to suggest this indirect negative impact of this invasive species. And in that case, because of what we're finding, it suggests that Bazzania trilobata could be used as a bioindicator species, which actually many bryophytes have been used, and this is sort of unusual for a liverwort. So much more work to be done in that area. And again, this decline, the status of this decline is sort of variable. And as far as additional future endeavors, at Smith College in Danielle Ignatius's lab, we have access to Liverwort 6400, and we just got a bryophyte chamber, so we're hoping to sort of look more into the ecophysiology and compare it to what we're seeing out in the field. By using this bryophyte chamber, we're hoping to do sort of light response curves, because there is some data on the ecophysiology of Bazzania, but not as much as we'd like. So that's sort of the direction that we're moving in, and this project will hopefully continue as well. It will be at McLeish in the future, and different factors will be looked at, including how maybe leaf litter might contribute to sample performance as well. So I'd just like to acknowledge the various people who have contributed to this project, my advisor, Bellemare, Danielle Ignatius, Valerie Nazaro, the Seeds Advisory Board of Smith, who gave me access to doing this site at the field station, and the funding that was provided by the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship and the Smith College Tomlinson Fund. And with that, I can take questions. Yes?
Did you put your little samples under other trees besides hemlock? I mean, could that shade, could those services be provided by other species?
We weren't directly looking at any other particular tree species, but the transects that we do have kind of reflect changes. So it's not, some parts are exclusively hemlock, but then you do get that mix. So there are like sugar maples and oaks and other things as well in that area.
And did they do okay under?
Yes, it's pretty much the majority of the mortality that we were seeing of the Bazzania were in areas that were clear cut, and also in areas that were too moist along the stream side.
Really nice study.
Thank you.
One of your slides seemed to suggest that there were some samples that did well in a fairly dry, fairly high-light environment. Remember that in the bottom
Yeah.
right-hand corner of your graph?
Yeah,
There were no mortalities at all, I think, in that study.
is it, not,
More.
uh,
No, X,
yeah,
no.
new,
There.
that
See
one.
the fairly far right,
Yeah,
there's about 10 in there.
yeah,
What's up with those guys?
those, yeah, that's really interesting.
Did they find umbrellas or they
Uh,
brought their own water?
That is a good question. So that might be sort of this individual variation that's kind of happening, and in some places, that's why we're hoping to actually look at things like leaf litter, because some of them are covered, so they might be sort of buffered, protected too by that as well. And we had actually installed another set of transects too that actually are looking directly at the impacts of clear cut. That's sort of happening in areas near McLeish, and that actually has some plants that have sort of succeeded and are kind of sheltering as well, this Bazzania. So that might be the key to its sort of success in these changing environments.